Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours, episode number 29, Deploying Passkeys for High Security Use Cases with our guest, Rolf Lindemann, and our co-host today, John Bradley. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So before I dive into this, maybe we can do some quick intros. Rolf, could you give us just maybe a quick intro of how you found yourself in passkeys and FIDO?
Sure, happy to do that. So maybe start at university. I was really focused on proven results on computers, not too much on security. But then when I finished university, the first job really was into a very new topic, which was PKI and Trust Center and all these kind of things. So I was a co-founder of a company called TC Trust Center. Got my way into all the PKI space with digital signatures and Digital Signature Act in Europe and Germany specifically. And later that company was then acquired by PGP, and then PGP was acquired by Symantec. And so there was a point where I just started to look for an alternative, something else to do. And that is where, I asked my former colleague to say, okay, give me a reference letter. And Rajiv said, yeah, happy to give you a reference letter. By the way, if you're looking for a job, we are working on something new, right? We have a very bold idea. We want to use fingerprint sensors to do authentication in a better way. And I said, okay, that sounds interesting. So I've understood why authentication with PKI didn't really take off. And so, yep, that was my starting point. It was in 2012 where I joined Knock Knock. And then we started on something that was a predecessor to the FIDO passwordless protocol, the UAF protocol in the first place, and it later became FIDO UAF, and so that's how I got into that whole thing, and helped with those bootstrapping work in the background, finding first companies, deploying customers, implementing technologies, etc., and get FIDO off the ground.
So, John, I've always known you as sort of a legend in the identity federation space. But maybe I don't actually know how you got there. So maybe you could give us a quick intro.
To some extent, almost entirely by accident, but that's how most things happen. It's only in retrospect that you have a plan. I started off, my background is actually in telecom. I used to be CTO of a phone company in Canada. One of my early companies was a BBS bulletin board software company. We're doing FIDO BBSs. Predating the authentication, ironically.
I'm not sure everyone out there even knows what a BBS is.
It predates the internet, and in any event, the company eventually became an internet provider and a telephone company. The software side eventually became a company called Exert Software, which was one of the first certificate authority vendors, which was eventually bought by RSA and became RSA Keyon, which is used by large organizations for running the certificate infrastructure. So I started looking at identity from a telecom perspective. I went on to develop, work on OAuth, OpenID Connect, and InfoCard, which was one of the first, which was, I guess, the first sort of broadly deployed digital credential wallet solutions, which was a spectacular failure, but we learned from our failures. Working on federated solutions, it became obvious to me that the weakest link in that chain was how do people authenticate? If you're going to tie all of your accounts together, that means that the one account that you're federating from is very, very important. So maybe you should protect it. So I started looking at certificate-based authentication wasn't practical for any number of reasons. So based on some of the FIDO work I had done, I got involved with Yubico and started developing the U2F spec at FIDO into the FIDO2 specification to add discoverable credentials. So I've been working for the last, I guess 7 years now, developing the FIDO specifications and how those are deployed. Now we're working with the European Union to develop secure cryptographic devices based on FIDO for the European e-identity wallets, and tying the underlying cryptographic properties of FIDO into some of the things that people are thinking of, the even newer credentials of European digital IDs and mobile driver's licenses, etc. So it all comes, in my view, it all comes down to managing keys. All problems are key management problems if you dig into them deep enough, and you need to secure the keys.
So I actually want to start this somewhat complicated conversation with a really basic question about two-factor authentication. And something that somebody said to me recently, I think it was Yuri Ackerman, you might know him from formerly from the FIDO Alliance, or maybe currently from the FIDO Alliance. And he said passkeys aren't two-factor authentication. And maybe that should be qualified, or not all passkeys are two-factor authentication. But Rolf, I think that people don't really understand this. Maybe you could dig into that a little more. Are passkeys two-factor authentication?
Yeah, happy to do that. So quick answer is it really depends on your definition of two-factor authentication. So that's with many things in our industry, we use a term and we have the feeling that we understand fully what it means. But if you dig into more details, we see, there are nuances with that, right? So if you tell two-factor authentication to a bank in Europe, they immediately think strong customer authentication according to PSD2 and independence of elements, and that you need very strong device binding and two different factors, and they need to be independent, meaning if one factor gets hacked, the other factor still works. Meaning, right, in that case, you typically have the requirement to have at least a secure element or a secure execution environment-based key protection and device binding from that. Yes, passkeys could get you that. And this is the second aspect of that. So that first was, what is the definition of 2FA? The second is, what's the definition of a passkey? The formal definition of a passkey, it's just a discoverable FIDO credential, right? The typical understanding, if I say passkey to someone which has just read articles on passkeys on the internet, would typically think a passkey is a synced discoverable credential, meaning it can sync and live on multiple devices, and they might think immediately about a specific passkey provider which implements that syncing. But those are just assumptions, right? So in the end, the world is a little more complex here. There are device-bound passkeys and there are syncable passkeys. And then it depends on the passkey provider which does the syncing, what they do, and it depends on the definition of two-factor authentication, what we really mean, right? I started with the high end, that's typically European Union, PSD2, very similar to AAL3 according to NIST. But if you get below that, like an AAL2, already two-factor authentication level, you could think of even a synced passkey being a two-factor authentication under very broad conditions, right? There is still an authentication intent. And now we get into that, do I know and how do I get the authentication intent? If you see the definition in NIST of that authentication intent, you understand it. Yeah, it's assumed to be a fresh thing, right? I want to authenticate and now I provide the intent, where there are some passkey providers which actually implement that in a slightly different way. They think if you have entered or provided your intent, provided the gesture once, and we can keep that information for quite some time, right? Which you can even extend and go beyond and think about a smartwatch and payment with a smartwatch. Not saying that they necessarily use FIDO, I hope they would, but you typically, when you put a smartwatch on, you enter a PIN code to unlock that watch, and now you keep it on your wrist, right? And unless you remove it, right, it will remember, so that if you use FIDO terminology, right, you would do the user verification at the time you put the device on, and then it would just keep the watch on that, right, for some time, and so the user would just provide user presence, meaning touch a button, which implicitly turns into user verification. So what I'm trying to say here is, it's typically a conundrum. It's a little more less binary, right? There's more continuum of different things, and it's the same for two-factor authentication, and the same for what is a passkey. Now, back to what I tell people, it's typically, where do you come from? If you are a bank, I would typically go with, okay, let's assume you, with two-factor authentication, really means something like PSD2 strong customer authentication. If you are a bank in the US, maybe it's already a little nuanced, a little below that thing. If you are just an e-commerce vendor, right, and thinking about, okay, now I want to do something for customers that want more protection, maybe it's way below that. And in that case, just having a syncable passkey without any additional guarantees would certainly meet that requirement, right? So it's a little gray here. And maybe one word here, this is a typical thing I've seen over and over again. Once you start thinking about authentication a little more detailed and more over time, you see things that are not directly visible, obvious to other people. And so in some way you are a messenger. You sometimes have to tell people that existing ways and simplifications have limitations and they are not quite accurate. And sometimes the concept of two factors and what is a possession factor, what is a knowledge factor, becomes questionable, right? Starting with what is a knowledge factor, which often ties into the two factor, right? It's a knowledge factor and a possession factor, a knowledge factor and an inheritance factor, right? People typically would give you, not typical knowledge factor is a password, right? We all know that. But in reality, we know that more than half of the population uses some form of password management, meaning they don't know the passwords. And to be honest, with more than 500 accounts, I can't remember all my passwords. So clearly, they are not a knowledge for me, right? So it cannot be a knowledge factor. And if that knowledge is maintained on my computer, it's kind of turned into maybe a possession factor, maybe nothing, right? It really depends on what you think and how it's actually being implemented. But now this is right? This is just a model that helped us, right? The authentication factors is a model that helped us to understand modeling authentication in the legacy days where we had passwords and OTPs and almost nothing more, maybe a little risk signals. And now we have gotten to a model, right? We have significantly more robustness added to that whole system. But it also means that we now have to rethink our terminology and the way we think about and talk about authentication and security. And that really has an impact. And so for me, it's typically simplified into what we need is robust security. And how I define robust security is typically it needs to resist scalable attacks, at least.
John, I'll let you comment on this also, but just one question. Rolf mentioned that he called maybe two-factor authentication definition legacy. Should we be pivoting to a different definition? Is the intent should we look at the intent and not the mechanics of two-factor? Do you think it's time to change?
I think that we have to look at what we're trying to achieve. So going back to what is it that you're trying to achieve at some point in history, in order, one of the biggest threats on the internet currently is password stuffing. If you don't care about whose account you're trying to break into, taking a list of common passwords and just trying 100 million accounts with them actually works quite well. So that's one of the things that two-factor authentication was meant to slow down, but it wasn't necessarily intended to stop targeted attacks. So different people had different goals with it. FIDO obviously, it has the properties of phishing resistance, which is really good. Does two-factor authentication on its own? Well, depends on the factors. They may not be phishing resistant, so that you may be more vulnerable to a targeted attack. So I think going back to what it is that you're trying to achieve, and to clarify some of the issues. So FIDO, WebAuthn, which is the thing that the relying party speaks, has a bunch of flags that it can send during the authentication. One of them is user verification required, which means that some sort of activation, which could be biometric or pass or PIN, needs to be used to unlock the credential, so that if somebody finds the authenticator, walks up to your laptop while you've gone for your tea break, they can't use that credential, which is on the device. So the RP, depending upon their security requirements, can say user verification is required or user verification is preferred, i.e., if you don't add too much friction by doing this, and the user has a local unlock method provisioned, then do the activation ceremony. But if they don't, then don't. So systems like, say, Mac OS, if you have your Mac OS computer in clamshell mode, you can't touch the biometric sensor. So Apple helpfully, if you say preferred, they will not prompt for activation based on the theory that you're already logged into the freaking computer. What more does the RP want from Apple's point of view? So they're not going to increase friction if the RP says preferred, but if the RP says required, then they will ask the user for their login password again to confirm. So the RP does have the choice of whether or not they want some local activation to use that credential, so that to provide extra protection from somebody walking up to your computer and using your credentials, if you're in a shared environment. But the reasons why you typically would want multi-factor for regulatory purposes, to prevent password stuffing, to prevent leaking of the password in a password breach, etc., are all mitigated by the FIDO protocol in the first place. So it's really only the advantage of doing a second factor in activation is kind of different between FIDO and the typical I'm putting in a password and doing a OTP, where in fact your password and OTP, is Rolf says, may actually be stored in your password manager, which has a single password for giving you access. So yeah, in the hi David, yes. So that's my engineering. Well, it all depends. And so you can meet the regulatory requirements by saying user verification required, and that provides you, certainly in the enterprise space, with assurance that people aren't leaving their laptops unlocked and some coworker coming up and using their credential.
So in my opinion, to get back on that, right, is really more relevant than whether it gets a label 1 factor or 2 factors or 3 factors, right? And there are nice cartoons showing a 13-factor banking authentication, which is totally unusable, is really to the robustness of the security. So what does it take? What kind of effort level does it take for an attacker to break that? And if you remember where we came from originally, right, that was passwords and OTPs, things which we know can easily be phished. And if you ask a user kind enough, they often are kind enough to tell us, right, what their password is. And if kind enough means presenting them a web page that looks very similar to the original one, right? So, or dialogues on a computer. So we can get to those attacks. And with FIDO, and that is, in my opinion, the biggest achievement we made, is we have gotten to a completely different level. We are not in an arms race anymore. We add yet another factor in the risk signal, right? The number 1013 or so, right? Another risk signal that can also be phished for other reasons. Maybe you can get into that, but we can get a level above and say, no, with a scalable attack, meaning just with malware on the computer, you have a hard time to really intercept the data, right? With social engineering, it's significantly more difficult. Now, maybe we have to talk about different attacks and protection against those attacks, but typically they are much less scalable than the existing attacks like password spreading or even phishing are today. And for me, this is one of the big achievements and one of the reasons, in my opinion, why the FIDO adoption is so successful.
Well, I didn't plan on having a 20-minute conversation just on two-factor. Let's move on. But
You have to
I
bring
think
us back
it
once a week if you want to cover more than 5 questions. I'm sorry.
shows- So, I've done a lot of FIDO demos in my life. And back in maybe 2013 or 14, when I was showing U2F, I would show basically how I'd register a device and I'd register another device in case I lost that device. I'd have a way to securely recover. And so my answer initially was, you better have a lot of devices. And then what became apparent is that I needed to register this device at every relying party. And I think that the market feedback was, this doesn't look like how people use passwords today, which is that when I boot up a new browser, my passwords are there and I'm ready to go. So I want to start talking a little bit about passkey providers. And Rolf, maybe I could put you on the spot. Why do you think we needed passkey providers rather? And what are some of the challenges that go along with that?
So yeah, it's very interesting if you see the FIDO development really happened in stages or phases, right? When we initially started, it was all about custom authentication where you only need FIDO and could replace legacy MFA, right? Then we focused and added the workforce, right, where we wanted a strong second factor, and then we moved it into the browser. And the last wave, really when Apple joined, right, was about thinking about the device migration, right? Until then, whenever I needed to bootstrap a new device, the method could not have been FIDO, right? So whatever you had to do was a kind of out of band, right? Or legacy authentication or whatever. It was not phishing resistant. And so we needed, and in my opinion, we need two things. We have one already, right? The first is we need a sync passkey to make that device migration easier, to essentially make the device boundaries virtually disappear, right? And that is, I think, what device vendors like Apple and other companies have been focused on for years, right? Where you have seen multiple different approaches that you now can sync different categories and open one browser on one device and then continue on a second device, right? And get your installed software components synchronized and all, right? Those things get easier over time. And now we can install a passkey provider that helps us to sync all my credentials to another device, which technically reduces the effort from one action for me per relying party that I have today, right, to one action per passkey provider. Think about you have maybe 5 bank accounts, right? And now you want to migrate to a new device. I did that recently. And now for every single bank, you have to do a different procedure. The other 95 accounts, right, non-bank accounts, typically are handled much easier. It's just a password, and there are password managers, which have a very similar role, right? They just make sure that you can move those credentials over to another device. Now the passkeys can go over to the other device as well. Now the disadvantage here, and that is what we really lose in some way, is a strong device binding, right? And you don't know how is that passkey provider do that kind of bootstrapping. So what you really want to have, in addition to everything you have today for bootstrapping a new device, is a verification of physical proximity to a known device, right? So for me, this is one thing missing. And there's another topic that you mentioned, which is a very interesting observation, right? The term FIDO, right, says fast identity online, where in the past we were just authentication, right? There was no identity in the system, really, right? We always say, yeah, the bootstrapping identity binding will have to be done in a different way. Sure, FIDO created an identity working groups and identity binding, and we spoke about that, but in the authentication protocol, it had no role, really. Now with passkey providers, it's the first time that the identity becomes part of the mix, right? Think you have all the credentials on one device in one passkey provider, you lose all your devices, now you get a fresh device. How do you get all these things back? Now the passkey provider has to do some kind of identity proofing, right? They have to verify it's really you. The level will depend on the passkey provider. Some might just send you an email to your old email address, which makes it a relatively low security level, but other passkey providers might ask you for something more sophisticated, maybe even some kind of national ID card. So you need to verify an electronic ID card or an identity wallet, right? So identity credentials that exist on that device or can be presented through that device, potentially even using other hardware components like a German national ID card that we have that is fully electronic and supports NFC, and I have a PIN for that, and right, so it's in some way it is a wallet in a single card, right? And I could use it. So for me, this is where it gets together, where there's a benefit of passkey providers. It reduces the complexity for the user to migrate credentials from one device to the other to a single action, as opposed to one action per relying party. And now we have to think about how to make that thing more secure, make sure the physical proximity becomes part of the bootstrapping process. We get support for device-bound credentials as well. Plus, we have a way for the relying party to understand what the identity proofing or verification assurance level would be, to really use that for something meaningful, meaning something that goes beyond just a simple password replacement.
John, I hate to say it, but a passkey provider is starting to sound an awful lot like an OpenID Connect identity provider. What am I missing here?
You're not missing anything, because many people in the FIDO community are in denial about the fact that we've just reinvented federation. Essentially, a multi-device passkey, which is backed by an account with someone, Apple, Google,
And an identity proofing process.
There may be an identity proofing process. There may or may not be an identity proofing process for account recovery. But essentially, you have an account which uses some sort of login, which has some sort of account recovery, which enables you to instantiate these credentials on some number of devices to be used across some number of IDPs. So it's moving the components. So you can kind of think of passkey providers. We also call them multi-device credentials. So a passkey provider, pluggable passkey provider, provides credentials which are available on multiple devices. It is sort of halfway between, the old single device U2F hardware credential and an identity wallet. It just doesn't have identity attributes yet. So
I think that there's one interesting difference, and this is it now works on your device, right? Where federation required me to do some kind of outreach to a cloud service every time, to a cloud service, which meant that cloud service would have to be available at exactly the time I want to use it. Now I'm not depending on that external cloud service anymore. I'm depending on an entity on my device which can cache a lot of information. It might still be shared with that cloud service, but at the time I use it, it doesn't have to reach out to that cloud service.
Right. From a security point of view, they're kind of the same. From an operational point of view, we've moved some of the components around to optimize the flow so that the identity provider still needs to be there. Otherwise, your devices will get out of sync and you can't move your credentials to a new device, but doesn't need to be there in real time. In the same way that for an identity wallet, the issuer of the credential, or PID, which is a personal identity document, looking at the chat, which is just geek speak for a PID is just geek speak for a European digital national ID.
It could have privacy impact as well, right? When you have to send the data to the cloud, it's accessible to that company, right? It is stored in some log file. So if someone comes and wants to get that information, they could, right? Where if you have the offline implementation on device, that could be implemented such that it does not send every single access to that key to the cloud service, meaning you can use that passkey to authenticate without telling the cloud part of the passkey provider that you have used that. That depends on the implementation. They don't have to do it that way, but at least they could.
Right. So from a privacy point of view, depending upon how it's implemented, you may actually be telling your passkey provider more information about where you're going and when you're using your credentials, which has pluses and minuses. So that also needs to be taken into account. I think the important thing is that because it is more like federation, you have to think about how is it that if I'm using Apple as an example for my passkey provider, how do I secure my Apple account? Because now if Apple has both factors of my multi-factor bank authentication, I really, really want my Apple account to have the strongest authentication that's possible. And Apple has rolled out FIDO authentication so that I can use a hardware security key to secure my Apple account, to secure my multi-device passkeys, which is something I personally do because multi-device passkeys are really convenient when they're deployed properly. But I also don't want to have my Apple account compromised, so I have like one provider which I secure strongly. Google has a program where you can secure your account, which stores your synced passkeys with a FIDO authenticator. So from if you're a high security user and you care about your security, one of the ways of dealing with it is, yes, you have the convenience of using multi-factor credentials, but secure those, or multi-device credentials, but secure those multi-device credentials with a strong authentication using something that isn't phishable or easily brute forced with Apple, Google, and I believe Microsoft also has something. The third-party passkey providers, 1Password, Dashlane, etc., are all working on those sorts of things. But you have to look at, if I'm storing all of my valuables one place, how do I secure that one place? And you want to probably increase that security. Just having all of your multi-device or multi-factor credentials stored, protected by a single-factor password is probably a bad idea. And some of the providers are forcing people to increase the security when they turn on multi-device passkey support in their password manager.
And I just want to make a quick point, of course, that passkeys generally don't, or a passkey provider is not going to provide a lot of claims. It's more about identification and less about your first name, last name, email.
It's about re-identification, re-authentication, because the only claim it knows is that, yes, I've made this credential for this entity, and you can prove that you're this entity again. By design, there's no personally identifying information that's contained in a FIDO credential. That's one of the sorts of dividing lines between identity wallets and FIDO has maintained, we want to have maximum privacy preservation. It only provides re-authentication in a pairwise way.
So maybe this might be the last topic, but enrollment is something that I've been thinking about more. So Rolf, in the video that we referenced on the wiki page for this episode, you mentioned how Google Authenticator allows you to clone your device. So you could have maybe your Google Authenticator on both your phone and your tablet. And then that raises some questions about who really there's not a one-to-one sort of mapping between the device and that credential anymore. And so what I'm seeing is that the enrollment process behind the credential, I think people have forgotten about that. And is there a way that we can could maybe recreate that? I heard a mention of a new term that I'd never heard of, supplemental keys, but how do we sort of maybe get this property back where I know that this is actually the key, not the copy of the key that someone else...
I think that there are two interesting topics you raised with that question. The first is, what kind of device binding do I get, right? And there we discussed the passkeys, right? Meaning the synced passkeys really And the way we described it was really, this is a passkey that could be freely shared, right? It could even be exported in the clear and maybe imported to a different passkey provider, where you don't really know the security characteristics of that passkey anymore, right? The only thing you know, it's very similar to a password, just it's more secure because phishing doesn't work directly, but I could still run into social engineering attacks, convincing the user to share the passkey with a malicious passkey provider that in the end, right, does things never should be done, right, with those passkeys. The second thing I mentioned in the early beginning were device-bound keys, right? Keys that could never be exported from a device, which is certainly the PSD2 assumption, right? When they talk about possession factors, they think cannot be copied, should not be copied, right? You need measures to protect against that. You need a secure execution environment to protect against all these things. Now, what you learn is there's even more, right? It's as if the world wouldn't be complex enough. No, there's one more thing in the middle at least, right? And this is we call it a provider scoped key, right? And there is an extension defined in web authentication to manage all the three or the two different keys in addition to that basic passkey that could be freely shared. But that provider scoped key could be a key that can never leave the passkey provider's boundary, meaning you might be able to share that with a friend, right? If the friend uses the same passkey provider, but you cannot export that from one passkey provider to a different passkey provider that implements a different security level. So that is number one. Number two is, how would you even know what kind of security level you get? And this brings us into attestation, right? Where in the example you mentioned with Google Authenticator app, right? People really were in a position where they thought, right, there's an Authenticator app, so this is a possession factor, right? It's just an assumption. You don't know nothing about that Authenticator in reality, that Authenticator app in reality. And now it could be a surprise for people that now it can be shared across devices, so that the implicit assumption that this gives you strong device binding was just wrong, which in my opinion means we need to get back to and emphasize the relevance of the concept of authenticator attestation, which tells you about the security characteristics. It doesn't have to be always the most secure one, but at least I, as a relying party, should know what I'm getting, right? And for me, if you combine that with the concept of provider scoped keys that you could get through the supplemental key extension, or device-bound keys that you could also get through that extension, or in different FIDO protocols without other extensions. But at least if the relying party in an abstract way knows the security characteristics of that authenticator that maintains the key and mediates the user gesture to unlock the key for a use, and that is a very important concept. And that is still missing. We are getting to that with that extension that supports attestation for that as well. We know that security keys implement attestation in real life. We know that some passkeys which are not syncable, right, on Windows devices give you attestation as well, so you know the characteristics. And for me, this is what many relying parties, enterprises, financial institutions, especially for high security environments, need to get in order to support the bring your own device scenario. Right? And this is often the driver, right? If I hand over a device from my company to you as an employee, I've verified that the device meets all my security requirements. If I allow you to just take one device and say, no, create a credential on that to access protected resources, right? I as a relying party need to verify that that device meets certain security characteristics, or at least know what characteristics it have, so I can augment, right, and offset the missing aspects here, right? And ideally just augment if it's required, so I can improve the user experience if the security is already great. Getting back to ideally device-bound keys plus provider scope keys with attestation, which allow me to understand how secure and what kind of identity proofing process, for example, would be implemented if the user loses all the devices and wants to get back to, access to all the credentials.
John, you have some thoughts? And John, I'll let you respond to that, but I have one more question about YubiKey specifically. Maybe this is a silly question, but I always, I think of YubiKeys as having non-exportable keys. Can YubiKeys be maintained at a passkey provider then? Because I think of passkeys as being sync passkeys, or so. Where do YubiKeys fit into this, into this conversation?
So YubiKeys store passkeys. They're not multi-device passkeys. But because you can move your YubiKey between devices effectively, they are the original, roaming authenticator. So if you have a credential on a YubiKey, you can use that across multiple devices. Certainly
By plugging it in.
Yes. It works reliably. People understand it. And YubiKeys have attestations. So if you want to use in the Czech Republic, I think it's called Moji ID, their national ID system, you can use a FIDO level 2 certified YubiKey to manage your national ID account. I believe Austria has the same. The Austrian national ID system also supports FIDO level 2 certified security keys. The security properties. So we have passkeys, which are just discoverable credentials, and you can have the highest security properties and get an attestation from them from specific devices. Then we have multi-device passkeys, which are kind of targeted at, it's a more secure password for broad consumer use. So there are different use cases. So one of the resistances that people like Apple and Google have is that people buy new phones, and they really want people to buy new phones, surprisingly enough.
Yeah.
So they want to make it easy for you, when you buy a new phone, to move all of your credentials over to that new phone. This is probably, if you think about it, it makes sense from their perspective. So they're resistant to adding any friction. So if a relying party, a consumer relying party, started tying these credentials to a specific phone, then you had to go back and do step-up authentication with every place that you've registered a multi-device passkey. It's going to be a pain in the ass, and your average consumer will push back on it. So different people have different tolerances for how much friction they're going to put through. I actually designed and built my own 3-factor authenticator, which nobody else other than me has been willing to put up with the pain of using, but it's really secure. So right now we're kind of going through a process of figuring out what are the requirements of the platforms, Google, Microsoft, Apple, for what they're willing to do, which is, a big part of the equation. Unless we can roll out a solution that's, available 90+% of the time when an RP attempts to use a passkey, it's not going to be successful. So right now, the only thing that you can use really are security keys in the high assurance use case. Finding a happy middle ground between it's a better password and a security key is work that's still in progress. And there are various proposals like device-bound supplemental keys, group-scoped supplemental public keys, provider-scoped supplemental keys, and a number of other things that will be available in the next year to 2 years. But at the moment, we really have, in sort of common deployment, you have the two ends of the spectrum where, as an enterprise, if you want to control your life cycle, you probably want to be using a security key. If you're a consumer website, then probably taking any pass key, which is better than a password, or a password and an OTP, is probably where you're at. It's hard for regulated industries that are dealing with consumers, etc., which live someplace in the middle. We don't really have an optimum solution for that at the moment.
Well, Ralph, since you proposed the session, I'll give you the last thoughts. Any last thoughts before we call it?
Yeah, so since we spoke about web authentication primarily and sync passkeys, there is a set of FIDO protocols that gives you device-bound keys and that can be used in native apps, and especially very helpful for consumer-facing apps. So that is what we see being used very often by mobile network operators, by financial institutions as well. So if they need that additional security layer, it might not be usable in a web browser directly, but at least in native apps, you get all that, right? That middle ground that you wanted, up to very high security levels and could even be higher, right? We have done experiments and real deployments in the first responder use cases in the US. So you can get to very high security levels, even with what we would call a platform authenticator, which doesn't require additional security keys. And so there is more to that, right, than just the focus on the synced passkeys, which most people think is a web authentication credential that is really synced across devices. And I think that is great. And one last thing, right, we discussed security levels 98% and above, right, where most people today are 30% with passwords and maybe 60% with legacy MFA, right? There is a good reason to move off of legacy MFA and legacy authentication in general, because it only gets more secure. It is there. It's very mature already, right? Even though we are discussing things where we can still improve, right? All the good things. But that's not and should not be a reason to hesitate and postpone deployments.
Okay, well, I want to thank you guys for joining us today. Next episode, we have Andres and Damien from Okta are going to talk about OpenFGA, a new authorization protocol, or a new authorization engine, actually, that uses graph-based or relational-based. It's a project at the CNCF. And I want to encourage everyone to follow Identirati Office Hours on LinkedIn. We're trying to get to 1,000 followers, so please just hit that follow button so you can get more event notifications. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I think we could have gone another 45 minutes on this topic, but hopefully
we could have gone another 3 hours on the topic. You just
easily
don't sugarcoat it.
Check the wiki page, and John and Rolf, if you have anything else you want me to add to the wiki page, just let me know. And audience, I didn't check the chat. I'm terrible at checking the chat. There's some good conversation. We can answer that conversation sort of on the LinkedIn page itself, because I get distracted and I like to focus on the guests and not on the chat. So we can keep this conversation going. But thank you guys so much, and thank you, audience. And we'll see you next Wednesday, not next Tuesday because I'm traveling, but next Wednesday for this open FGA discussion. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.